welcome to all of you at this last lecture of the series, The Elusive Shape of the Platonic Tradition, which has consisted of 8 online lectures by eminent scholars working in various aspects of what might be called the Platonic tradition. And as the title suggests, this is an elusive concept, but not entirely ungrounded. And we have seen a very diverse set of scholars and lecturers. We heard a lecture on Plato, actually on Plato's Phaedrus by David Schindler, but also about poetry of Owen Barfield, a comparative lecture by Kevin Corrigan on Plotinus and Neoplatonism and Chinese philosophy, Taoism. We have heard a lecture on political philosophy, obviously linked to Plato's Republic. Also a lecture on art and technology by Gareth Bulmere, and about Mexican philosophy and religion of the 17th century, linked to the Guadalupe apparitions. So it's really a diverse set of perspectives, which are, I believe, joined by the fact that all of them refer to a continuous tradition from Plato and Aristotle through Plotinus and the Church Fathers, the medieval philosophy, and then until our times. Today, the last lecture will be delivered by an eminent scholar working on that tradition, the Platonic tradition, Professor Douglas Hedley, who is the professor of the philosophy of religion at the University of Cambridge and a fellow of Clare College. And Professor Hedley published books about Coleridge and his grounding in this tradition, as well as books dedicated to imagination and its the role it plays, especially in the Romantic philosophy of the Romantic period. And now Professor Hedley is working on the subject of play, seen from a philosophical perspective. However, today Professor Hedley will be talking about the Cambridge Platonists, who are also a part of this continuous Platonic tradition. And more specifically, he will talk about the concept of the divine mind in the Cambridge Platonists, Henry Moore, most prominently. So without much further ado, Douglas, I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And if I may just thank you very warmly for all your encouragement and support over the last few years. It's been a wonderful experience to collaborate with Poznan. I'd like to begin with a quotation from William Ralph Ing, the Dean of St. Paul's, known as the Gloomy Dean, from his book, The Platonic Tradition in English Religious Thought. And it's quite a long passage, but I think it's an interesting one, and I hope it will be instructive as a way into my topic this evening. He writes, "My point is that the religion of the spirit, that autonomous faith which rests upon experience and individual inspiration, has seldom had much of a chance in the world since the Christian revelation, in which it received its full and final credentials. We may call it the Platonic tradition, since the school of Plato ended by being completely dominant in the last age of classical antiquity. We may venture to call it the true heir of the original gospel, while admitting that no direct Hellenic influence can be traced in our Lord's teaching. We may confidently call it Pauline and Johannine Christianity, though the theology of St. Paul is woven of many strands. We find it explicitly formulated by Clement and Origen, and we may appeal to one side of that strangely divided genius, Augustine. It lives on in the mystics, especially in the German medieval school, of which Eckhart is the greatest name. We find it again with a new and exuberant life in many of the Renaissance writers, so much so that our subject might almost as well be called the Renaissance tradition. Our own Renaissance poetry is steeped in Platonic thoughts. Later, during the civil troubles of the 17th century, it appears in a very pure and attractive form in the little group of Cambridge Platonists, Whichcote, Smith, Cudworth, and their friends. That is, I think, a powerful introduction to this group of thinkers who were consciously seeing themselves as part of a Christian theological tradition. Thomas Gale, the Regius Professor of Greek and Fellow of Trinity College, seems to have coined the term Neoplatonism in English in 1670. And this coinage was part of a revival of Platonism that Ing has referred to. And this was part of a discussion that had a very strong European dimension to it. So, what I want to suggest to you this evening is that the philosophy of the Cambridge Platonists constitutes a fascinating bridge between Renaissance Florence and the emergence of Neoplatonic thoughts in the Romantic period. Cambridge University, during the turbulent years from Charles I's succession to the throne of Great Britain in 1625, to the appearance of Rafe Cudworth's Opus Maximum, the true intellectual system of the universe, in 1678, constitutes a remarkable period in the history of Platonism. Now, the motto of that work, in fact, is drawn from Origen. It's the line that human wisdom is the training of the soul, its goal being divine wisdom. Gymnasium te psyches e anthropine Sophia telos de ethea. This quotation neatly captures the humanism and theological aims not just of Henry More and Cudworth, but the Cambridge Platonists in general. So, contrary to the impression conveyed by Ernst Cassirer in his otherwise important and significant work, The Platonic Renaissance in England, the Cambridge Platonists were modern thinkers. And they form a significant stage within the Platonic tradition that you've been discussing during this series because of their subtle negotiation with some of the decisive and specific developments in the modern period. The experimental scientific method, biblical criticism, and many radical social changes, civil war, execution of the monarch, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. In 1644, the Earl of Manchester systematically ousts the leading royalists in the University of Cambridge, and emerging out of the Puritan stronghold of Emmanuel College, several of the Cambridge Platonists become masters of Cambridge colleges during the Civil War. Rafe Cudworth is appointed Master of Clare in 1645. Benjamin Whichcote becomes the Provost, i.e. the Master of Kings, in 1651. So these were, in a way, philosopher kings but nevertheless, far from being unscathed by the convulsions of the age, Whichcote, in fact, was evicted from King's College during the Restoration, and both Henry More and Cudworth were fortunate not to be evicted by the Restoration regime. Nor was the thought of these Platonists uncontested. There's a rather remarkable work by Samuel Parker called A Free and Impartial Censure of the Platonic Philosophy, which was published in 1666 and was a public criticism of the Cambridge Platonists. So it's worth bearing in mind that they are working in this turbulent, violent context, and they are also subject to philosophical and theological critique. Now, the term the Cambridge Platonist is derived, or seems to be derived, from the Scottish uh, theologian John Tulloch in the 19th century. Um, but it does, I think, clearly refer to a number of uh, intellectually aligned thinkers. And I think this becomes particularly clear when we look at the idea of the divine mind. So even though there are differences between these thinkers, as you would expect with philosophers and theologians, and indeed More in particular has a tendency to change his mind over the course of his career. Nevertheless, there are strong uh, parallels and similarities. And I would say that is explicable in terms of this common Platonic tradition that they are drawing upon. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to think of these figures as, in a way, Erasmian humanists who are convinced of the profound relevance of ancient culture for contemporary life, but who are also deeply interested in the new science of Descartes, Hobbes, and Spinoza, as well as Bacon, Boyle, and the Royal Society. Rejecting the aridity of the contemporary university scholasticism, bear in mind that the dominant philosophy being taught in Cambridge in the 17th century was a form of Iberian scholasticism. Uh, they tried to build a philosophy that was opposed to both the positions of Descartes and Hobbes. So More and Cudworth were moderns in relation to natural philosophy. They're supporters of the post-Galilean science, and they are arguing for an atomistic theory of matter. However, they are rejecting a purely mechanistic natural philosophy, and in its place, they want to propose that spirit is the fundamental causal principle in the operations of nature. They were philosophical theologians who believed in the compatibility of faith and reason and tried to integrate philosophy and theology. They were all concerned with providing convincing reasons for the existence of a transcendent God and indeed for the immortality of the soul. Both More and Cudworth have a largely optimistic view of human nature, which, as we will see, is linked to their theory of the divine mind, and place great emphasis upon the freedom of the will, in opposition to the doctrine of double predestination of the Westminster Confession and the High Calvinists. They are, one might say, moderate dualists who are rejecting the radical dualism of the Cartesian res extensa and res cogitans, but they are insisting that mind is ontologically superior, prior to matter, and that the truths of the intelligible realm are superior to empirical knowledge. On the question of grace, they agree with St. Thomas Aquinas that gratia non tollit naturam sed perficit, and like Thomas, they also hold to the priority of divine goodness over voluntaristic accounts of divine sovereignty. So I'd say that even though they are critical of contemporary um, scholasticism, they uh, have many tenets that overlap with Thomas Aquinas. Salvation for both of them is thought in neither in juridical or forensic nor in quasi-financial redemptive terms, but in as the restoration to a living relationship with God. And scripture for them is not to be judged primarily uh, as words, characters, or ink, but through its capacity for the quickening life of the Spirit. So, um, as is clear, they have access to the works of Plato and to late antique uh, Platonism, and it's particularly interesting that 17th century Cambridge was the site of considerable critical and philosophical interest in Neoplatonic texts. So we find Iamblichus's De Mysteriis is published in this period, as is a text of John Scott's Eriogenes Periphysion by Thomas Gale of Trinity College. Um, and one could say that uh, Eriugena looks like a pretty obvious forerunner for these philosophers, even though they don't refer to him directly. Um, just a couple of points before we turn to the question of the divine mind per se. I've mentioned the Westminster Confession and the principle of predestination. We'll come to see that that background is central for the philosophical theology. But More is himself also a poet as well as a philosopher. And I think this is an important point that is often forgotten. So More writes poems at the beginning of his career, poems modeled on Lucretius and Spencer. They are anti-Lucretian poems, but they are Lucretian in the sense that they are genuinely philosophical. And it could be argued that one of the major sources for the particular Platonism of Henry More is derived from the great poet Edmund Spenser, who, of course, as some of you will know, was later very important for C.S. Lewis. So you could say that there's a direct link between Spenser, Edmund Spenser, Henry More, who was a Spenserian poet and writes philosophical poetry, and C.S. Lewis in the 20th century, whose great ambition was to become a poet, who, um, while he's trying to establish an academic career, begins a doctoral dissertation on Henry More, and ends up publishing his first academic work, The Allegory of Love, about Spenser. So this combination between poetry and philosophy is important to bear in mind, not just in terms of the provenance, because it is to some extent still unclear where this Platonic revival is coming from in Cambridge. And one of the most obvious sources lies in the poetry itself. But also, these figures were experimenting with different philosophical forms. So I think in contemporary context, it's easy to forget the extent to which poetry has been a vehicle for philosophy from the pre-Socratics onwards, um, and that the our divisions between poetry and philosophy don't always make sense in that um, in this 17th century context. Now, Um, Another point that is worth mentioning here is the connection between the Platonism and the so-called ancient theology. Now, it has often been noted that the Platonism of the Cambridge Platonists does not look very close to the analysis of Plato's dialogues that one might encounter in a contemporary philosophy or classics uh, department in the Western world. Um, and that is partly because they are drawing on a tradition in which Plato himself is the bearer of a more ancient tradition. So they're not Platonists because they think that Plato himself, the Athenian, is the source of all knowledge, but rather because they see Plato as the brilliant articulation of an earlier and more ancient theology that they associate with Moses. Now, there's also, interestingly, a very significant link with the Jewish Kabbalah here. Now, many of you will be familiar with the Neoplatonic dimension of the Jewish Kabbalah, and the Cambridge Platonists were instrumental in the entry of Jews into England in the 17th century, led by Manasseh ben Israel. And as a result of the interest in the work of Isaac Luria, we find an intensive discussion of Kabbalistic themes and a intense reception of this Jewish thought in connection with More's friends, Franciscus Macarius von Helmont, and his friend Christian Knorr von Rosenroth, perhaps the greatest Kabbalist of that period. Rosenroth was a great admirer of Henry More. He regarded Henry More as one of the leading philosophers of the age, particularly impressed by More's tract on the immortality of the soul. And through More's heroine pupil, Lady Anne Conway, with her circle at Ragley Hall, we find an extraordinary revival of and discussion of Kabbalistic themes in the wake of Henry More's own philosophical work. So, um, so uh, I think that these are aspects of the Platonism which make these writers seem somewhat puzzling from contemporary perspectives. But in terms of the history of thought, their relevance is considerable, not least because in the Romantic period, the idea of Tzimtzum, for example, becomes very central. And indeed, you can find 20th century thinkers like Simon Weil drawing on this tradition. So even if some aspects of their thought seem rather baffling to the modern mind, they are nevertheless of great significance for understanding the history of thought. Now, I don't wish to claim that their only significance is in relation to their influence on other thinkers. I think rather that they have something to offer to us today, and in particular, their theory of ideas and their conception of God. So the doctrine of ideas, with its roots in the Phaedrus myth and many other dialogues of Plato, um, particularly Republic 509d following, um, is adopted in the following way. Sensible things which come into existence and perish are images, reflections, they talk about ectypes of eternal essences, archetypal forms or ideas. Now, these ideas are the thoughts of God, the elements which constitute his eternal wisdom. So the wisdom of God is that of the world of ideas, the mundus archetypus, according to which he produces the visible cosmos. So human beings, according to Moore and to Cudworth, attain knowledge insofar as they apprehend the eternal thoughts of divine wisdom. So insofar as human beings are spurred to reflection by the stimuli of sense, they enter into communion with the mind of God. And in that sense, see things in God. Now, this interaction is facilitated by the fact that the spirit of mankind has a particular union, or communion rather, with the divine spirit. So, just to quote here, all minds partake of one original mind. Those are the words of Cudworth. And they are reproductions of the eternal mind. Now, the intriguing thought here would seem to be that epistemology requires theology. The theory of knowledge involves supposing an eternal subject whose forms, or without whose forms, the mind of human beings would be blind. So, in his Antidote Against Atheism, Henry Moore speaks of relative notions or ideas, cause and effect, whole and part, like and unlike, rather like Kant speaking of the categories of understanding. He says that these relative ideas are, quote, no external impressors upon the senses, but the soul's own active manner of conceiving those things which are discovered by the outward senses. And then in his Kabbalah, it's a text titled Kabbalah, in a passage, he says, the soul of man is not merely passive as a piece of wood or stone, but is forthwith made active by being acted upon. And therefore, if God in us rules, we rule with him. If he contend against sin in us, we also contend together with him against the same. If he sees in us what is good or evil, we ipso facto see by him. In his light, we see light. Now, in the philosophical poems, there is a passage which discusses innate ideas, or indeed a priori forms. If plantal souls in their own selves contain that vital formative fecundity, that they a tree with different colours stain, and diverse shapes, smoothness, asperity, straightness, acuteness, and rotundity, a golden yellow, or a crimson red, a varnished green, with such like gallantry, how dull then is the sensitive, how dead, if forms from its own centre, it can never spread. So, um, so here we have an account of the a priori um, in the mind and its significance for um, epistemology. So reason is here conceived of by Henry Moore as the consciousness of selfhood as a creature made after the image of God, and as a mirror, the reflection of the eternal reasons of things which constitute divine reason. So, reason then needs not to have its dictates enforced by any alien power. Insofar as they are promulgated, they are carried out. So, this reason in their epistemology is consciousness of the whole. It's awareness of God in humanity and humanity in God. Of course, not here conceived of in a pantheistic, spinocistic sense, but in a dialectical Neoplatonic sense. So when we get to truths apprehended by reason, which are eternal and immutable, that is necessary, they are at once the contents of divine wisdom and the conditions of human knowledge. Now, this takes us to what is perhaps the central doctrine of these thinkers, and which is particularly important in relation to the Calvinist background, and that is the discussion of the relationship of God's will to his wisdom. So, the wisdom and goodness of God is understood as the perfect order of the archetypal world, system of ideas or concepts dwelling from all eternity in the divine intellect. By the will of God, they mean the going forth of his power in producing and conserving the physical cosmos and all that it contains. So, Moore and Cudworth insist against Descartes and others that God's will did not make and cannot alter the contents of the intelligible world, which they claim have natures essential, not arbitrary. That is to say, God's will is shaped by his wisdom and goodness. His will expresses his essential nature. He cannot make right wrong or true false by an arbitrary volition. And here's more from the philosophical poems. If God do all things simply at his pleasure, because he will and not because it's good, so that his actions will have no set measure, is it possible it should be understood what he intends? I feel that he is loved of my dear soul, and I know that I have borne much for his sake, Yet it is not hence proved that I shall live, though I do sigh and mourn to find his face. His creatures wish he'll slight and scorn, nor of well-being, nor subsistency of our poor souls when they do hence depart, can be assured if liberty we give to such odd thoughts that thus pervert the laws of God, and rashly do assert that will rules God, but good rules not God's will. Whate'er from right, love, equity doth start, for aught we know then, God may act that ill, only to show his might, and his free mind fulfill. And Cudworth writes similarly, he says, Plotinus writeth, the deity acteth according to its own nature and essence, and its nature and essence displayeth goodness and justice. For if these things be not there, where should they else be found? And again, elsewhere, God is essentially that which ought to be, and therefore he did not happen to be as he is. And this first ought to be is the principle of all things, whatsoever that ought to be. This is evidently a paraphrase of Ennead 6:8. Wherefore the deity is not to be conceived as mere arbitrariness, humour, or irrational will and appetite omnipotent, which would indeed be but omnipotent chance, but as an overflowing fountain of love and goodness, justly and wisely dispensing itself, and omnipotently reaching all things. So there we have this stress upon the divine essence, and the uh, theological significance of the theme of divine goodness. Um, there is more that one could say about this theme of the divine wisdom, which is which we find in various figures like Rust and Henry Halliwell, um, and John Smith in particular. Uh, but I want to, at this point, turn to the idea of the Trinity, because an important aspect of the theology of the Cambridge Platonists is um, the Trinitarian uh, dimension of their thought. Um, so uh, this was also at the time fairly controversial. They were, in fact, accused of being Arians, uh, and this was a period of um, fairly uh, radical criticism of their supposedly Socinian or um, or Aryan tendencies. Um, and of course, the situation in England was one in which both Arianism and Socinianism were particularly important, um, for various reasons to do with the uh, political situation. Um, now, um, sorry, I've lost my place. Um, um, yeah, so I think that this Trinitarian understanding of the Godhead, with special attention given to the metaphysical status of the second person of the Trinity is um, is an important uh, theme. More articulates his view of the Trinity, whereby the second person is described as eternal mind, essentially intellect, causally soul, participatively the good. So the model looks hierarchical and subordinationist. And as I mentioned, there was considerable controversy about these uh, topics in England at the time. The good is the highest principle for more. It is singularly self-originating, and its essential attribute is that it is the most perfect. It is the only one who does not participate in a higher metaphysical order, according to More. Now, More, of course, also stresses the unitary aspect of the deity, and he uses analogies to illustrate this union, particularly familiar Platonic images of the sun and its rays, the center and its rays, or the surface of a globe. The Godhead possesses one single will, though he again um, is that which, as it were, is the heart, the center, root of the deity, the eternal self-originated good. Now, he seems to present this is more the procession of the second and third persons from the third principle as necessary. Um, he says it's not a creative act, as creation entails the freedom of choice of a finite kind that would be inappropriate within the divine mind. The good, he says, without the two other principles would contradict its very nature. So here's the, again, deeply Platonic thought that the good is self-communicating. And he insists, however, that worship is to be given to all three persons as God, since ad extra, all three are creators and governors. So you might say that there's a creative tension here between his interest in holding to theological orthodoxy, but given his Alexandrian background and particularly his interest in origin, you might say that there is a subordinationist tendency within uh, Henry More's theology. That he says still within the Godhead there is a progressive diminution of perfection from the good to the intellect and spirit. Anyway, I leave that as a uh, as I swear, a question for the theologians. But what is clear is that for both More and Cudworth, the theological question of the Trinity cannot be divorced from the questions, the metaphysical questions about the nature of the divine mind. And this has a considerable legacy in the 18th century through figures like Leibniz, uh, uh, with his critique of Visivatius, and via Leibniz and Lessing, again into the Romantic period. So not it was not just via the Kabbalah, but also those persisting debates about the doctrine of the Trinity that the Cambridge Platonists remained important figures in Western thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we have time for questions, comments, remarks, or a discussion. So if you want to,
Before people start, could I
yeah,
just publicize a book? So this
yeah.
is a book that I edited with Christian Hengstemann, and it's called an anthology of the Cambridge Platonists.
Can
And
you hold it? Can you hold it a bit higher? Okay. An anthology of the Cambridge Platonists, sources and commentary.
Yep. And we had a particular reason for editing this work, which um, starts off with the uh, um, well, apart from the introduction and a kind of historical overview, with the critique of Calvin, Hobbes, René Descartes, Jacob Boehme, and Spinoza. I mean, what's interesting is that Moore, in particular, is the one of the first critics of Spinoza, um, Descartes, and Boehme, and also his discussion of the Kabbalah was very significant for the 18th century. But then we have sections on the character of metaphysics, the existence of nature of God, space, nature, body, and spirit, then epistemology and ethics, so on vision, freedom, reason and knowledge, power and politics, and then faith and reason, the soul and the resurrection of the body, soul-making theodicy, Christ's sacrifice, and the restitution of all things. So we wanted to produce a thematically organized anthology because the majority of the other anthologies that you can find on the Cambridge Platonists tend to be excerpts from um, their spiritual writing, and they we wanted to show the extent to which we are dealing with philosophers and theologians. So that was the reason for the thematic structure of the anthology.
Thank you. Thank you for this brief introduction into this anthology. And now questions or comments. Jeff Hippolito.
Yeah. So, Douglas, great to see you. Thank
See you,
you
Jeff.
for the wonderful talk. Yeah. So, just a quick note for you that may be of interest, and then I have a question also. The note is that it occurred to me while you were talking that there may be a portrait of Lewis in Owen Barfield's novel English People. This character, John, who was wrestling with who's a Platonist, wrestling with whether or not to become a theologian, novel written around 1930, and is writing Spenserian poems.
Mm.
So, or writes a Spenserian poem in the course of the novel. So, you may want to. It hasn't been published, but I can direct you to where you can find it if you're interested in following up. But
So sorry, could
okay.
you
In any
tell
case,
me
so
that?
my question,
Sorry, that what was that reference? I didn't quite.
yes, so it's a novel by Owen Barfield.
Mhm.
Has not yet been published. Um, it's called English People, and the character I think maybe partially modeled on Lewis is this
Yeah.
character named John Trinder, and so he's the one who I would look at for that.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I could say more in a different context if you like. It's probably not great use of our
Mm.
time here, but it's in the Bodleian, and there's a PDF available that I can send to you if you like.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah.
But yeah, so anyway, so that's that. And then my question is um, whether or not so you mentioned they had Iamblichus available to them,
Mm.
and I didn't know that, Cambridge Platonists. And I've been wondering about um, whether the romantics, when they pick up the notion, the Platonic idea of kind of the poet as mage, that they're um, well, I know there's a tension within Neoplatonism some of the late antique authors around whether or not magic is respectable or not, the magical. And
Mm,
the poets often equate the poetic with the magical. And I wonder if think of Wordsworth, Coleridge, William Blake, even, and Percy
mhm.
Shelley, and so on. And then that continues through the pre-Raphaelites, that those circles, and then into some of the modernist writers,
Mm.
and so on. And maybe I don't know if it goes beyond Kathleen Raine, but she would be a part of that.
Yes, yes.
And so I wonder if that doesn't actually begin, because I know the Romantics are reading the Cambridge Platonists, whether or not they're picking up some of that from them as well. I just don't know their writings well enough. Like, are they interested in that question of the poetic in relation to the magical?
Um, Not that I'm aware of. I mean, so uh, Cudworth was often used um, as a sort of source of quotations. So, um, because the true intellectual system, of course, is so vast, so it was treated as a compendium of texts and thinkers. And the later Neoplatonists are particularly important for him as source material. But Cudworth himself is evidently much more, um, or feels much closer to Plotinus than he does to any of the later Neoplatonists. And I think that's partly because of the idea that Plotinus and Origen were best buddies. They were, uh, they were sitting warming uh, the the benches in Alexandria uh, together as students. Um, so the idea that Plotinus was somehow Christianized through what, of course, now the majority of scholars would reject the identification of the pagan and the Christian um, the origin as the uh, is oh sorry that yeah yeah as one and the same and thereby their link with Plotinus, but that's one of the reasons why uh, Cudworth can happily regard um, Plotinus as virtually a Christian thinker, quite apart from the legacy of Ficino and the way that obviously Ficino Christianizes uh, Plotinus to some extent. Albeit, I would say the difference between Cudworth and Ficino is that whereas Ficino tends to, um, let us say, elaborate Plotinus via Denis the Areopagite, uh, Cudworth does that through Origen. So, um, and again, there's an interesting story about why that was the case. Um, I would say that the real link with the Romantics, since you raised that issue, is with the idea of divine presence, which again I'd say is very much a Neoplatonic notion. So Smith, for example, says in his considerations of the divine nature and attributes, he says, and as God thus preserves all things, so he is continually ordering and disposing all things in the best way, and providing as may be best for them. He did not make the world as a mere exercise of his almighty power, or try his own strength and then throw it away from himself without any more minding of it. For he is that omnipresent life that penetrates and runs through all things, containing and holding all together with himself, and therefore the ancient philosophy was wont to say that the world was in God than that God was in the world. He did not look without himself to search for some solid foundations that might bear up this weighty building, but indeed reared it up within him and spread out his own omnipotency under it and through it. So this notion that it is better to say that the world is in God than God in the world. I mean, this sense of divine presence, the think of the Aeolian harp, um, all those various passages in Coleridge that many literary critics say are pantheistic. I would say it's this Platonic tradition, which of course is not pantheistic, but nevertheless is stressing the divine immanence.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Maybe while you're thinking about it, I have one question about uh, the term Neoplatonism,
Yeah.
because yeah, you mentioned that. So it's interesting. You date it to the 17th century, since I guess a pretty standard view that I encountered is that it was first used in German by Büsching in 1772, Neuplatonismus, and which was defined by him as eine unklare mystische Schwärmerei.
Yes, yes.
So it was obviously pejorative.
Yeah,
But
yes.
I thought that the sources of this are late 18th century German history and philology. Well, you said it was 1670. This term appeared in English.
Yes, I think so. That's I would need to check the reference for that. Um, but Gale is a interesting figure. Um, he and I think one of the intriguing aspects of these thinkers is this textual and philological work that's going on in this period. And um, so uh, Thomas Gale was born in 1635, dies in 1702, and he was at Trinity College, and there would seem to be a group of Platonists at Trinity College. In those days, the colleges were quite independent. It was rather like sort of San Gimignano in Italy, with these colleges being like these independent towers. And he uh, he was an editor. Um, he produces this edition of the De Mysteries in 1678. Um, and um, so it's intriguing that we have that at the same time Spencer is producing an edition of Origins Contra Celsum, uh, and we also have John Scott's um, De Divisione Naturae edited at this period. So it's striking that we have this period in which um, Neoplatonic works or works from that milieu or emerging out of it um, have been edited. I mean, that doesn't answer your question about the.
Yeah,
I
but
don't know.
yeah, it would be just interesting to see whether this term appears in his edition of Iamblichus or in another.
I need to check
Okay,
that.
okay. Just
Right,
I don't
that's
want
interesting.
to
Yeah.
I don't want to interrogate you about this right now. I just think it's an interesting because I saw that Lloyd Gerson, for instance, in his fairly recent book on Platonism, he refers back to Bushing and to the end of 18th century. So it may not be well known if this term appears indeed, and it would be an interesting piece of the history of this term, which obviously changed its meaning a lot.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
and
Um,
so to follow up on that, did Gale also provide a translation of the Mysteries by Iamblichus in his edition?
it's just an addition
The,
that
of the
he's
Greek of the Greek
yeah,
text.
yeah, yep. Um, so um, sorry, just one moment. I'm just trying to check this. Uh, because you raised this very interesting point about um, the source. Um, yes, I'll have to get back to you about that. Um,
Sure.
but yeah, um, I found this in the reference to him in Dumbarton Oaks.
Mm.
But I need to check the um, yeah,
Mm.
the origin. Yeah, I mean, it would certainly make. I mean, the Germans in the 18th century were often very dependent on English writers. So, um, uh, so you find, for example, writers like Robert Louth, um, and who wrote a book on the poetry of the Hebrews, where he was defending um, the poetry of the Hebrews uh, as having its own validity vis-a-vis Greek poetry. Um, and figures like Lessing and Herder were um, familiar with English, which of course at the time was not a widely used language. In the 17th century, Dutch is much more important um, than English. Um, but there is a tradition of scholars in Germany in the 18th century using these 17th century English sources. So it's perfectly
Mm.
possible, I think, that
Yeah, and since in your scholarship you show how the Cambridge Platonists they were read by German philosopher and German academics in the 18th century. So it wouldn't be surprising that
mm, mm,
if that term actually appeared in the 17th century, that it was picked up by the Germans exactly at this point. But it's just a curiosity.
thank you for that. That's
Yeah.
nice.
And also, just to follow up on Iamblichus, because recently we have been, uh, as some of you know, that we started this project on the early writings of the Inklings, and Gareth Bulmere, also associated with the Cambridge Centre, who collaborates with me on this project. He went to Bodleian to look at some of the unpublished
Mm,
materials
mm,
of Owen
mm,
Barfield, his notebooks where Barfield was noting, the books that he was reading in 1920s or some quotations. So just I had just a cursory look on some of the pictures that Gareth took, and it's very interesting. In fact, how much of the well, Plato is the most often uh, uh, quoted
mm,
author by Barfield. not as much Plotinus as I would have hoped for, but apparently, from what I saw from the notebooks, Barfield was reading Iamblichus, the Mysteries. So I think he was probably interested in that because of Rudolf Steiner and his
Hmm.
Steiner wrote this famous book on Christianity and ancient mysteries, and it was a kind of important thing for Steiner to show the continuity between. We've just discussed this today with Jakub, the importance of this mystery tradition in Christianity for Steiner and obviously for Clement of Alexandria and the
Yeah.
Alexandrian tradition. So I think it's an interesting detail that Barfield was interested in that particular treatise. I have no idea, what's the history of Iamblichus Themisteri in the English literature. But I think again an interesting continuity with what you were talking about this and of course Lewis was familiar with the Cambridge Platonists, so they might have discussed that with Barfield as well.
Yes. I mean, the figure for whom it is important um, is Thomas Taylor. So Thomas Taylor, of course, has a huge influence on the Romantics. Um, but there's an interesting agenda with Thomas Taylor in, um, and I've written a piece where I discuss this a bit on the legacy of Proclus, uh, where Taylor is an out and out advocate of Proclus and Iamblichus as an alternative to Christianity. So he's a radically anti-clerical Platonist who um, feels that the Christian appropriation of Platonism by figures like Dr. Cudworth is an abomination, and that the true Platonic tradition needs to be divested from these uh, Christian trappings and distortions. And the Iamblichus as De Mysteries is very important for Taylor. So I think the later influence. Now, um, Rain was fascinated by Taylor, and uh, and I think stressed Taylor's importance for Blake. So and indeed for Emerson as well. So Thomas Taylor, I suspect, is the source of this influence of Iamblichus on later figures. Um,
Yeah,
I mean,
maybe
eh? Sorry?
just a quick comment that yeah, he would. So if he's reading those, Barfield is reading the Iamblichus in the late 20s. I wasn't aware of that. That's fascinating to me. Um, that's the same time he has his Great War with C.S. Lewis, so-called Great War, named by
Yep.
Lewis,
Yep.
and running debate they had, most of which is not recorded because it's in person and they're talking. We just have a few letters and some essays they wrote to each other. But it's very interesting to me because kind of the crux of the disagreement between them was how should I put this? Metaphysically vibrant, you might say, the imagination is, and Lewis wanting to curtail it, and Barfield wanting to expand it, and so they're having debates around various texts like De Anima, for example, Aristotle.
Hmm.
What is the active mind exactly, and so on. Um, so I wonder if it isn't also just thinking of the Inklings project and a part of that ongoing struggle that the two of them are having, and that Barfield is enlisting a figure who might be helpful to him also, in
Yeah, and
addition to the Steiner connection, which makes a lot of sense.
mm, yeah, I mean, I think that one has to also bear in mind in relation to this reception of Platonism that in antiquity, and again, this is helpful, I think, for reading Coleridge and even Cudworth at times, is that obviously in antiquity, Platonism became an alternative to Christianity. So I just saw Jeffrey being attacked by the cat.
He's ready to be fed. Yeah, we're having
Okay,
a
okay, okay.
existential
You're
struggle.
still alive. Good. Um, so the Scottish government apparently is cutting down on cats because apparently their negative effect on birds. But the wisdom of the Scottish National Party. Um, anyway,
Oh, I'm glad you
the
jumped in here.
the yeah. So the I think one of the paradoxes that we're dealing with here is that figures like the Cambridge Platonists and indeed the Inklings can draw upon a profoundly Platonic tradition that has been Christianized and, of course, transformed in many ways through its baptism, as it were. But in antiquity, Platonism was the vehicle of a lot of uh, criticism of uh, Christianity. Um, Obviously, a whole range of figures in the later period who are, and quite possibly Plotinus himself, who are very hostile to the Christians. So Heinrich Dörrier uh, once famously claimed that uh, Christian Platonism is an oxymoron because Platonism and Christianity are uh, incompatible. So what I think the figure of Taylor draws to the fore in a rather interesting way is uh, a tension that we find in a number of Christian thinkers who are operating in this highly Platonized Christian theological world. And um,
Hmm. Yes. And also wanted to comment on one thing which is just interesting to me out of my ignorance about English culture of the 17th century. But when you were talking about the links between the Cambridge Platonists and the continental
Mhm.
philosophy, I think it's very interesting how much they were in dialogue with different figures from
Yeah.
Europe. And for instance, it's interesting that you mentioned this Christian von Rosenroth, the
Mhm.
author of this book on Kabbalah, that
Yep.
he came from Silesia. I
Yep.
even looked up that now there is on a Polish website dedicated to the history of this part of Silesia. There is a quite extensive biography of him in Polish. So of course Silesia is interesting for various reasons. The all sorts of the crossroads of various national and cultural traditions. The Polish, the Czech, the German. Jakub Böhme, of course, was from
Yep.
Silesia, and so especially in the 17th century, it seemed to be a very important place where mysticism, uh, alchemy, Neoplatonism, all of that was very alive and even emanated as far as to the British Isles, which I found really interesting. And also this connection between Aryans, because of course in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth there was a, a strong group of Aryans, the so-called Polish Brethren, who
Hmm.
were interested in the ideas of Socino and
Yep.
this kind of Unitarian strand. And so it's just interesting that you can find these similar philosophical religious currents in Central Europe and in England at the same time, and it seems that Germany or German lands despite the 30th war, the 30 years war, or because of the 30 years war, it acts as this mediator between
Yes.
these various. But what strikes me is the sort of Europe is still, despite of the wars, religious wars, there is still this sort of unity and exchange of ideas in Latin mostly, but not only in Latin, it seems.
Yeah.
So I just find it very, very interesting, that there are these connections.
Yes. And particularly, I would say, in relation to the dogma of the Trinity, because of um, a sort of network, a European network, which stretched from Transylvania, Italy. Um, I think now remind me, was Visovatius
Mhm.
Polish?
Yes, yes, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah,
Wiszowaty
yeah, yeah.
in unpronounceable Polish version of his name.
So
Yeah, so the Latinized version, of course, was
yeah,
much easier.
so Visovatius is the um, object of Leibniz's attack, which also influences Lessing. And uh, you see the connection between the question of the divine mind and the Trinity is a connection that, as I suggested at the end of my talk rather briefly, links the Cambridge Platonists to Leibniz and Lessing, and indeed through to the German idealists, where the Trinity is not straightforwardly a matter of dogmatic adherence in the sense of uh, some unthinking acceptance of a otherwise totally unintelligible dogma, but the key to the metaphysics and this great metaphysical mystery. And part of the background to that is the influence of Socinian literature in the 17th century in England, which was extremely uh, profound. And in fact, I'll just get a book here, uh, which is rather interesting on this, by Philip Dixon, and it's called, I don't know if you can see it here close to it's called Nice and Hot Disputes, the Doctrine of the Trinity in the 17th century. And it's a very useful account of these battles between Socinians and Arians and various defenders of orthodoxy, and indeed battles between defenders of orthodoxy. So Cudworth and More saw themselves as defenders of orthodoxy. Neither of them were avowed Arians, but because of their adherence to a basically Alexandrian form of Platonism, um, there were subordinationist elements in their language that other contemporaries picked up on and which were later criticized. So um, it's just I think intriguing how this pan-European debate about the nature of the Trinity, which is merging out of Renaissance figures like um, Socinus himself, but then later figures like Visavatius. Um, and then, of course, that leads to the emergence of Unitarianism as a movement of considerable significance in England in the 19th century and in America. So a figure like the great poet T.S. Eliot was, of course, someone who grew up in Unitarianism and then uh, left it as an adult. And in some respects, he was reflecting uh, a development that you find in Coleridge, because Coleridge himself was attracted to to Unitarianism. But that's a debate that is um, having strong European sources. But I think the difference is that um, many of the most virulent debates on the continent were tied up with the understanding of the sacraments. So basically, Catholic and Protestant divides because of the uh, settlement after the 30 Years' War. Whereas in England, um, the prominent debates um, were really about the doctrine of the Trinity in this period.
Hmm. And well, it seems to me that, but maybe I'm wrong about this, but that what also enhances this exchange of ideas is the fact that Protestants are or dissidents in general, they feel, and quite reasonably at times, they feel that they have to be nomads, so that they have to they feel persecuted in Catholic countries or also sometimes in Protestant countries like Burma, and so some of them they have contact with other groups in other parts of Europe. I'm just thinking about Comenius, Jan Amos Komensky, a Czech philosopher who, I mean, when you look at his life, he was traveling a lot. So he went to Transylvania, for instance, Transylvania, and he had some contact with Protestants there.
Yep.
He had contact with Protestants in Poland, Lithuania, where he lived for a long time. In Poland, Lithuania, he met Samuel Hartlib, who was born in a German-speaking family in northern Poland. Then he moved to England and he invited Comenius to England. So Comenius goes to England, and then Comenius ends up in Amsterdam, of course, which was the capital of Calvinism. So it seems to me that these sometimes small groups of radical Protestants they were creating these islands.
Mhm.
And they, of course, felt that Catholicism is this, the whore of Babylon over Europe. So, so I'm just wondering, is that a right intuition that uh, the sense of the Catholic dominance over Europe, it sort of enhanced the contacts between these Protestant groups, or it's not necessarily?
Um, yes, there must be something in that. Um, and the I think the figure of uh, well, if you mentioned Knorr von Hosenroth, who, as you say, is born in Silesia, um, and who is friends with the Flemish Van Helmont,
Mm,
and so they basically um, that whole debate about the Kabbalah is stimulated by um, Van Helmont visiting more sending him to Lady Conway as a physician, in fact. I mean, he was meant to uh, assuage her headaches, but through his presence in Ragley, then the connection with Knorr von Rosenroth is is established. Um, and then this leads to this absolutely fascinating uh, interaction between Henry Moore and Knorr von Rosenroth, which, because of Knorr von Rosenroth's Kabbalah Denudata, which has such a seminal influence in 18th century letters, uh, and it contains chunks of Henry Moore. So one of the ironies of Henry Moore is that he starts off describing himself as a Kabbalist, by which he basically means a Christian thinker. He then discovers the genuine Kabbalah and finds aspects of it that he disagrees with, including the idea of the Simsum. Um, but his various utterances about and writings about Simsum um, become part of the Kabbalah Denudata. So malgré lui, um, Henry Moore becomes a Kabbalist, um, even though he's a controversialist who's been attacking the Lurianic Kabbalah as soon as he came to know about it. But I think it is a an extraordinary instance of the Republic of Letters, which may well have been stimulated by the desire of Protestant thinkers who obviously could rely upon Latin as a lingua franca and um, finding uh, support in countries like Britain or the Netherlands. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, I think so, or a comment, a remark. Okay, so if not, I think we can thank one more time Professor Hedley for his lecture, and this is the last lecture in the series. So I also want to thank all the speakers and all the people who attended lectures of this series. Uh, they are available on the YouTube channel of the Faculty of Polish and Classical Philology of my university, Adam Mickiewicz University. If you want a link, of course, you can email me and I can send you one if you want to listen to one of the lectures you missed. So that was, I think, a very interesting series showing the richness of the tradition and the need for further exploration and research on that. So thank you very much. Thank you, Douglas, for today's
Thank you.
presentation. And goodbye, good evening, or good day to those across the Atlantic, specifically. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, Douglas. Thanks, Mateusz.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you both.